Jane Mayer is a highly awarded writer for The New Yorker. She has written several books on money, elections, the war on terror, and American government. Her best-selling book, Dark Money, traces the murky depths of right-wing donor class funding the rise of extreme conservative agenda. She will be in conversation today with Rob Reich. Mr. Reich is a professor of political science at Stanford University and the faculty coordinator of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. His new book, Just Giving, Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better, is a look into how we may need to reconsider some shared beliefs about the role of philanthropy in a democratic society. Mr. Reich examines large inequities within the world of giving and how both big and small charities can fail the causes that they claim to celebrate. Mr. Reich discusses ways forward in addressing charities that can provide necessary access to public goods rather than influence policy in favor of the wealthy. Please join me in welcoming Jane and Rob to Politics and Prose.
Thanks to all of you for coming.
Thanks so much. Welcome, everybody. It's great that everybody came out on such a freezing night. Rob, this book, people sometimes accuse critics of criticizing things that are like, motherhood and apple pie, and you have criticized the PTA in America here. I think that even goes beyond motherhood. It's kind of a combination of motherhood and apple pie. So I guess I wondered, people think of philanthropy as something that's an unalloyed good, right. People doing good. What possessed you to write this book?
Yeah, well, the PTA figures into this. So it's first of all correct that I am attempting to provide a critical framework, and through that framework, criticism of philanthropy, something that does ordinarily come across as innately good, especially if what you're comparing it to is the alternative of someone not giving money away at all and just buying more stuff of their own. Surely any philanthropy, no matter how it turns out, is preferable, the thought goes, to just keeping more money for yourself. And indeed, that's what I want to criticize in the book, that basic view. And it starts with the PTA. So, around 10 years ago, I packed off my oldest child to the public school system in Palo Alto, California. My guess is that there's a similar phenomenon out here, not merely with sending the kids to public school, but about what I'm about to say. On the first day of kindergarten, my son came home from school with a whole bunch of pamphlets and things from the school district, extolling the virtues of the public schools in Palo Alto, and a glossy form that said, that year, my expected but voluntary contribution to the Palo Alto school system was $2,000 per child. And as a parent, I sort of fell out of my seat. And then as a scholar, I thought to myself, as someone who'd been writing about education and education finance, I would try now to collect a bunch of data on the phenomenon of private giving to public schools, often championed through the PTA or PTO, which have been converted from holding bake sales and spaghetti dinners into holding glossy auctions that raise thousands and thousands of dollars per child, at least in the Bay Area. And the common sense intuition, in fact, is borne out that wealthy suburbs can raise a lot of money per kid, and poor places like East Palo Alto can't, or big cities like San Jose, Oakland, San Francisco don't. On top of it, I found then that giving to the PTA or giving to the local school foundation counts, legally speaking, as a charitable contribution. So you're giving to a 501c3 public charity. So there were tax advantages for your giving to your own kid's public school. So I had in front of me an example of what seemed to me a charitable act that was heaping further advantage on already relatively advantaged kids and parents. And that was subsidized by the rest of the country in the form of foregone tax revenue, so that all of us as citizens are subsidizing the worsening of an inequality that I thought some government agent was responsible for addressing in the first place. Here's a charity in my mind that had something to do with almsgiving, assistance of the poor, combating disadvantage. Private giving to public schools is basically the inverse of all of those things. It's rich people helping basically rich children, heaping additional advantage onto people who are already advantaged, and doing so with a subsidy from the rest of us for the entire process, and on top of it, calling it a noble and civic act, which I want to add at the end here. I don't mean to demean that impulse. I think in their heads it is a good thing to do. I don't think they're necessarily aware of how little charity goes to serve the poor or the disadvantaged. And then that led me into this much bigger project. If this was going on in the PTA, what's the rest of charity look like? Why do we have tax deductions? What the hell is a 501c3? Where'd that come from? So the book aims to examine these public policy choices that the United States and then in some other countries have made to try to structure the universal impulse to give money away.
So just to go on with the first example that caught your attention, what would be the alternative if there was no tax deduction and parents were not encouraged to give to private schools or public schools? I mean, private schools in a way are even more a matter of sort of
Although the
enriching the
tuition
rich.
is not
but-
tax deductible.
No, it's not. But I mean, if you take a look at some of the most prestigious private schools in the country,
Yeah.
St. Paul's
Sure.
or Exeter and Andover, they've got libraries that are nicer than any
Yeah.
you'll see,
Yeah.
except on college campuses,
Right.
basically.
Stanford has some nice libraries too.
So, so what is the argument? Is it that there should, what would be the alternative? Would you rather that people feel the pinch in
Yeah.
this country of what it would be like if there is no extra funding for those public schools? Then
Yeah.
governments would have to actually pay for everybody to
Yeah.
have better equipped schools. Is that what you want?
There's three thoughts, and I'll keep this really short. So one is in the direction that you're suggesting, namely that when I went out and talked to people who give a lot of money to support the public school, they'll say, often correctly, well, if Sacramento actually had its act together and funded the schools in California in a way that was appropriate, then we wouldn't need to do all this philanthropic fundraising. But since Sacramento screwed up, we have to do this. So the thought is, in the absence of having this permission to give money, parents might be, relatively speaking, more likely to attack the root source of the problem. So you get the savviest and most politically able parents in all of California directed through their social circle to support the school auction and do better by their own kids in the public school system, rather than heading off to Sacramento to champion change at the appropriate level. Appropriate meaning it would solve the problem for all students. So that's one thought. The second thought would be, why have a tax deduction for giving to a, relatively speaking, wealthy public school? What if we just got rid of that? If you want to make a contribution to your own kid's public school, do it on your own dime. Don't expect a subsidy for it. But even on top of that, and this is what I sort of contemplate in the book, I discovered that there are certain types of giving. People often say philanthropy is the best example of the voluntary expression of the liberty of a person to do what they want with their own money. But there are certain types of giving that are actually blocked. Independent of a tax incentive, there are certain things you can't give to. So the example I give in the book about that is, imagine if instead of your public school, your block in whatever neighborhood you live in here in the DC area, the budget of the city was cut, there was a crime wave, you thought that bolstering the police force would be the right way to attack a crime wave. You try to go to the mayor, the city council, get no response, and so instead you and your neighbors get together and you say, we'll offer a charitable contribution, a private donation to the city police department to hire an additional officer whose only patrol will be your block. You say this will free up additional resources for the police department, and you call it a charitable act. You're trying to help other people around you who might not be able to make this contribution. In actual fact, the DC police will send that donation back to you because you don't have the permission with private dollars to direct a public agency's operation. Now, evidently that's true with public schools, but not true with the police. So there are places where we want to block the ability of people to give money, even when we acknowledge the money is theirs.
So we generally, I mean, I know from having been a critic of, for instance, when I was looking at how the Koch brothers gave their money, you encounter a lot of resistance when you're critical of giving money away,
Right.
and for sort of obvious reasons. But it wasn't always true, was it, in American history, that everybody thought it was a wonderful thing for the rich to be able to set up private foundations?
Yeah.
How did this all start?
Right. So when I got interested in this topic, I went to try to learn something of the history of philanthropy in the United States, in particular the policy structures. Where did we get the private foundation from? That's a sort of unusual corporate form. And the story of that goes back to the first Gilded Age in the United States and the era of the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. So I discovered that when John D. Rockefeller, who had amassed the largest fortune at that time of anyone ever in the United States, wanted to create a general purpose foundation, a philanthropic entity to steward his giving, he went off to the US Congress to ask for a bill that would incorporate the Rockefeller Foundation with this global, national, and local scope and a very general mission, whatever it is now, to support humanity or humankind. And instead of getting a celebratory reception for his philanthropic impulse, he arrived in DC and got stiff criticism. The idea of a wealthy person who had announced himself as now wanting to take his mountain of money and have a public influence by using his private assets to change public policy or to decide what public benefits to create was not met with gratitude, but was met with criticism. So I'll just share with you one or two passages because they're so potent and so unfamiliar to hear today. So when Rockefeller showed up in DC in 1912, the sitting US president said the following. So this is Taft. Taft said, the bill is nothing less than a bill to incorporate Mr. Rockefeller himself. The former US President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, said, no amount of charity in spending such a fortune can compensate in any way for the initial misconduct in acquiring them. The president of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, of course, Rockefeller had been engaged in various forms of union busting with Standard Oil, said, he was good at sound bites, Samuel Gompers said, quote, the one thing that the world would gratefully accept from Mr. Rockefeller now would be the establishment of a great endowment of research and education to help other people see in time how they can keep from being like him. And then there were other people who said, leave aside the fact that he might have done all kinds of harm in creating the fortune he had. For those of you who have read Anand Giridharadas' book, Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World, this is basically his line of criticism. The line he often gives is that the harms done by marketplace daylight can't be undone by the goods done by philanthropic moonlight. We have to inquire into the legitimacy of the money you make in the first place. But there were other people who said, leave aside that, give the benefit of the doubt to the Rockefeller and his advisors to say that they're well-intended. But there was another passage in which a sitting US senator said we should not authorize the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation because it's repugnant to the whole idea of democracy. You would think, well, why is it repugnant? And the answer to that is it's virtually by definition a plutocratic voice or a plutocratic element in a democratic setting. So by definition, it's only a wealthy person that can create a large foundation. And if the idea of the foundation is to direct private assets for some public benefit, or, as you document in Dark Money, not merely for a general public benefit, but to change public policy, which is in fact the self-avowed goal of many large philanthropists, you're essentially saying to wealthy people, here's an unaccountable, basically non-transparent, donor-directed and tax-advantaged corporate entity for wealthy people to have a greater say in the public sphere. And why, in a setting in which we prize the political equality of all citizens, would that be thought to be a welcome thing? And that's the source of the criticism of Rockefeller. And so, at a bare minimum, one of the things that I hope, my book might contribute to is a shift in the attitude to big donors from automatic celebration and gratitude to much more scrutiny, so that the power that a plutocrat wields serves rather than subverts democratic institutions.
So how did I think one of the things that you argue that makes this kind of philanthropy so controversial is that it's tax subsidized,
Right.
basically, because
Right.
it's tax deductible. All taxpayers are subsidizing the donor. How did that ever come about? Because it seemed like it was right around the same time that income taxes were invented, correct?
Yeah,
Is
the two go together.
and so was one a deal for the other, or how did
In a
this
certain
work?
way, it was. I mean, so Rockefeller and Carnegie gave their money away to their foundations without any tax incentive to do so. And one of the things I point out in the book is that if you think the tax incentives are a necessary part of philanthropy, if we get rid of the tax deductions, people will stop giving money away. Well, think about Alexis de Tocqueville, the most famous visitor to the United States, who championed, this country as a nation of joiners. We do for ourselves, where in other places people look to government. All of this happened, this nation of joining stuff, in Rockefeller and Carnegie, without any tax incentive for giving. And so the tax deduction came about when the personal income tax was created in 1917, which was put in place to fund the war. And the worry was having a bunch of rich people set up these large foundations. Now they'll have an income tax levied on them, and that they'll pay their taxes instead of giving to charity. So there was an initial carve out that they wouldn't tax their charitable contributions. But at that time, there was no 501c3 sector. There was no definition of what counted as a public charity. It was really a very small thing, and then layered over time through lots of different past acts in Congress with very little, rational story to tell about it. The 501c3 sector in the United States became this all things goes, anything goes sector, and the incentives to give got written into law in much more significant ways than only applying to these millionaires who set up foundations.
I mean, there seems to be an aspect of it that's a tax avoidance scheme for some people. I mean, it certainly was true of some of the major funders of the right. They put it into they met with their tax lawyers and figured out ways that they could fund their political causes this way. But I guess when you criticize it, people say, well, then we won't, the Red Cross won't get any more money, and that it would be tragic if there was not the tax advantage. So what do you say to your critics about that?
Yeah.
Because it's not a popular position.
No,
to
it's
get rid of
definitely
that.
not a popular position. Well, I'd say a couple things. So first of all, what I already said, namely that we have a bunch of examples historically, in fact, decades and decades of American charitable behavior that existed without any tax incentive. So we can point to long stretches of American history prior to the introduction of the tax deduction in which people in America were evidently quite charitable. Second, I'd point out that when you do surveys of people who give, they often say that charity or giving philanthropically is a kind of personal virtue, or it's an obligation you undertake religiously, and they're not tax optimizing in giving to the Sunday basket at church, which is a tax deductible gift in the United States. They're doing what seems like a religious obligation, or they're doing something like giving to the Red Cross, which is just a good thing to do. Now, the evidence does show, this is an empirical question, not a philosophical question, that certain types of recipients, basically selective higher education, the sort of institution I work at Stanford, and cultural institutions like museums and operas, people are engaging in some tax optimization quite frequently there. So if we got rid of the tax deduction altogether, it's likely that some giving to those types of institutions would go down. Giving to religion, I would predict, would be effectively unchanged. The tax incentive for giving to a religious institution is a public subsidy that's a clap on the back for doing what you would do anyway. And you might wonder whether if giving went down marginally to places like Stanford or Harvard or the Metropolitan Museum of Art, well, people still retain the liberty to give to them. So if you want to do it entirely on your own dime, by all means go ahead. But why should many people think their whole country subsidize giving to something that is either extremely well endowed already, a place like a university that I work at, or a place where it's unclear what the real general public benefit is? Sure, arts are important, but relative to the soup kitchen and a whole bunch of other things like the Red Cross, shouldn't the tax incentive really be working there rather than this all things, all considered or everything goes sector as it now stands?
So when you think of giving to philanthropy, you think of it as kind of redistributive. Basically, it's an optional way to decide, this is a problem I want to solve, and it's usually you think of it as helping the poor, or as you say, sometimes a cultural institution. But is it? It seems like in your book you're arguing that it's not redistributive.
That was
is that right?
Yeah, that was the surprise to me. Is I really did go into the research in this book thinking, as I'm guessing at least some of you do, maybe if you work in the nonprofit sector, you're aware of this already, but I wasn't, that the vast majority of giving in the United States does not go for almsgiving, poverty fighting, disadvantage combating purposes. And so there's some studies I quote in the book that show two things which are surprising. So first of all, if you make maximally generous assumptions that even given to places like Stanford, you could give for financial aid purposes, and that should be counted as assistance to the disadvantaged. Or same to the museum. It allows the kids from the inner city school to go to the museum to get. So if you maximize the assumptions about what percentage of giving to those places counts in the poverty relief category, at most 30% of all giving in the United States is in that direction. And the thing that's even more surprising, or was surprising to me, is that the higher income you are, so the wealthier you are, the less likely you are to give to poverty relieving organizations. So the poorer you are, the more frequently people champion giving to soup kitchens and those kinds of places. The wealthier you are, the more frequently you give to higher education and cultural institutions. And the last thing here is that the tax incentive, the tax advantages that go to philanthropy massively advantage wealthy people as opposed to middle class and poorer people as a mathematical function of what a deduction is. So the higher your progressive tax rate, the greater your subsidy rate for giving. So our public policy mechanism for stimulating charitable giving is ridden with a plutocratic bias. It massively advantages the already wealthy in amplifying their already considerable voices. And last thing, if we thought that the preferences of wealthy people in their giving mapped onto the preferences of all people, maybe that wouldn't be an issue. But in point of fact, the preferences of wealthy people look like some of the people that you covered in Dark Money. They're looking to affect public policy in relatively narrow ways or to support their alma mater or cultural institutions, which are hard to construe as these general, strict public goods that all people can benefit from.
So is there any policing of this particular part of the American economy? I mean, it's a pretty big chunk of change you're talking about. You had it, I think $800 billion is in the
$410 billion given away last year in the United States.
And what was the $800 billion? Is that or
I think it's
600?
Yeah, the total amount of assets that exist in foundations is in the neighborhood of 800 or 900 billion dollars.
It's a tremendous amount of money.
It's a huge amount of money.
So is this all supposed to be overseen by the IRS, and are they supposed to decide that whatever it's going to is not political? Is that
right? Well, of course, there's been a big controversy over the past couple of years about this sort of thing in the IRS. There's two agencies tasked with, as it were, policing or monitoring the nonprofit sector, including foundations. The first is the IRS, and that's the initial stage of being approved by the IRS to be a 501c3 public charity or a private foundation. And I did some research on this, and I was shocked to find, so it wanders a little bit every year, but almost every year there's between 60,000 and 80,000 newly created 501c3 nonprofits. And if you drop out of the calculus applications that weren't completely filled out, that didn't actually get a final judgment by the IRS approves over 99% of applications to become a 501c3 nonprofit. So there's effectively no policing of charitable purposes by the IRS. The other entity charged with monitoring are state attorneys general. So they exist chiefly to look for the most rampant corruption and abuse cases, paying the CEO of the nonprofit $1.5 million, staff costs amount to 95% of the budget, or there's like self-dealing going on between someone on the board and what the charity does. In those relatively rare cases, state attorneys general might get involved. But for your run-of-the-mill ordinary nonprofit organization or private foundation, there's effectively no oversight. Now, I will say we're leaving out one important source of oversight, and that's your line of work. Journalists can be incredibly important to this entire enterprise. That's another place where it seems to be a lack of oversight, because the number of journalists who are, have a philanthropy beat is, in any major newspaper or magazine, I think basically zero. There's a Chronicle of Philanthropy, which is published here in DC. I met with some of the people there today. It's one of the few standing outlets that covers the sector. I hope and want them to do way more investigative work than they have done, although they've done more than most places. And I think that journalists have to play the conventional role of holding power to account, and philanthropy, big philanthropy especially, is a form of power. and having more people do stuff like you had to go through to cover the Koch brothers and other right-wing funders would be great for examining American philanthropy.
Well, part of the problem is there's not much transparency, as you
Yes.
point out in your book. These are kind of unaccountable organizations
Right.
that sometimes are by statute go on in perpetuity,
Right.
without any kind of public oversight in
Yeah.
particular. So. It makes it hard. I guess I wonder about something that I don't think you do address it in the book, but don't these philanthropies also serve a purpose of kind of whitewashing the reputation
Yeah.
of the vastly wealthy people who give the money away, and they look so tremendously generous then? I wonder, what would they look like if they weren't able to give this money away and take a tax deduction?
Yeah, I think you're right. The best example, today is the Sackler family now coming under all of this scrutiny for having funded various parts of the opioid crisis, and apparently, based on the lawsuit and the material I've just been reading about in the paper, part of the Sackler family themselves, through the pharmaceutical company that produces the drugs, actually deliberately pursuing maximal profit, even in the face of evidence about the harms that were occurring. And of course, the Sacklers are major donors, as the Kochs are as well. And
they are the Sacklers much more into sort of cultural
That's right.
centers. I think the Sackler Museum here is a not the direct. It's a brother of the person that
Right.
made the greatest profit
Yeah.
from OxyContin. But in Boston, there's a Sackler
Yeah.
wing of one of
Right.
the museums that's from that family.
yeah, I mean, so this is an old question in philanthropy in certain ways. So if you work in the foundation sector, the nonprofit sector, I'm not sure who said this first, but the line amongst anyone who raises money is the problem with tainted money is that taint enough of it. And some people take that line, that if you can repurpose even ill-begotten gains for some obviously good end, that somehow redeems the initial problem. But as you point out, you're then participating in the reputation laundering of the individuals who are doing the philanthropy. I mean, the philosopher in me wants to say this is basically something like, if I were to steal your watch and then sell it at a pawn shop and take the proceeds and give it to the most effective charity that there is, you would have no reason to excuse me for having stolen the watch in the first place, and I would owe repair to you, even if I had given it away for some effective purpose. And if there's an initial, crime that's committed, then whatever good you do with it is no way undoes the initial problem.
Well, now that we're sort of entering a new Gilded Age to some extent, when you look at the concentration of wealth and the new fortunes being made out in your part of the country, in Silicon Valley, do you think this issue is entering, anything like a crisis point, or at least more? I hate to use the word crisis when you've got Trump talking about the
Right.
crisis on the border. Okay, so I don't want to hype this.
Right.
But is it reaching a point of greater importance to the country and significance, and a point where you think the people in power are going to take a look at it, or should?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to see at some point, a kind of commission that's formed, whether it's through Congress or appointed by a state or even the federal government, that kind of explores the phenomenon of big philanthropy in the United States, and whether the policies we have, that we allow perpetuity, that there are all these tax advantages, that you can do, as you say in your book, you report in your book, basically weaponize philanthropy, call yourself a donor, and yet do very naked political giving as a philanthropist. These seem to me to be problems from the standpoint of what would count as healthy democracy. I don't think we're quite at the point where this is likely to happen, but I would love to see at the minimum way more scrutiny. So, I mean, in certain respects, here's the thought that I would offer you as a stimulus to this later point, which would be, in this second Gilded Age, I think we live in a moment in which the wealthiest people amongst us are taking most of the economic gains relative to the rest of the population. They're trying everything they can do to diminish their tax burden, legally speaking, as close to zero as they can get it. having withdrawn from their contribution as a citizen to the IRS or the public sector. They complain about the dysfunction and ineffectiveness of government. And then they declare themselves a philanthropist, taking a further tax advantage in setting up a private foundation. They themselves direct the distribution of various public benefits to people, and in return for the entire sequence, ask the citizens to bend over in gratitude to them for the actions that they've undertaken. In a Gilded Age, the power that people have in the marketplace is already significant, as anyone who looks at political giving knows. And then if we compound that power by offering nothing but celebration of our biggest donors so that the philanthropic power they wield is gone completely unchecked, well, we live in an age of plutocracy, not in an age of democracy. So at some point, as happened in the first Gilded Age, there was a progressive revolt and across a whole variety of fronts, including philanthropically. Maybe we're headed in that direction, but I'd say it's too early to say with any confidence.
To play devil's advocate, I guess there are some philanthropies probably that you think are the
Right.
developments in philanthropy that are really good, where private foundations are trying things that are just not being funded elsewhere in this society. And as a journalist, I noticed there are a number of sort of charitable organizations now that are or NGOs that are running journalism operations.
Yeah.
Would you think that's a bad thing or a good thing?
Yeah, well, I was hoping to talk tonight about this in part because I get the chance to speak with you about it. So I'm curious, in your view. So, my book is not only a critique. There's a framework that's meant to try to provide an analysis of what would be a welcome set of activities from the standpoint of philanthropy, welcome from the standpoint of democracy, and what types of public policies there would need to be to help shepherd it in that direction. And when it comes to big donors and big foundations, part of what I suggest in the book is that large foundations have a chance to try to do things that aren't likely to happen in the marketplace with firms and aren't likely to happen in public agencies of a democratic government, both of which, the marketplace and democracy, are beset by relatively short time horizons. Your investors will not give you a long leash if you don't show any return, and in a public agency, unless you show some benefit through public spending, the person responsible for standing election the next time around is not likely to be reelected. So what foundations can do, or what big donors can do, is to take advantage of this analysis of the basic political economy across the board and think in a longer time horizon sense about where there are things that aren't going well in the marketplace and aren't going well in government. And at the moment, journalism happens to be one such place. So the business model, the for-profit model of journalism is under threat, or it has basically gone up in smoke for most places. And there's deep resistance for all kinds of reasons to having journalism funded by the government itself. So perhaps philanthropy can come in here, and here I want to turn the question back to you. So the New Yorker is not funded philanthropically, to the best of my knowledge. Condé Nast is an ordinary for-profit company. Not true?
No, it's a for-profit. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's owned by largely by the Newhouse family.
Yeah, that's right. So for-profit companies. That's the old model. Relatively rare these days. But then the Atlantic Monthly, purchased by Laurene Powell Jobs, an LLC, but in a philanthropic model. Jeff Bezos, of course, he's not running the Washington Post as a nonprofit, but he's basically a philanthropic patron of it. You have ProPublica, funded by nonprofits. You've got the LA Times, purchased by a billionaire on basically the Bezos model. We could go on and on. There's a bunch of basically philanthropic experiments underway to underwrite journalism. And so, I don't know, you work in the sector, is that good?
I think also Laurene Powell Jobs wants the Atlantic to become a profitable investment. I don't think she's going into it as a charity. I mean, she's doing it, I think, for public purposes, but also has the goal of having it eventually make money, from what I understand. I'm a little leery of it. I don't think that, I think the thing is, what's the alternative? Most of us who work in journalism have been owned by one wealthy family or another, whether it's the Sulzbergers or the Newhouses, or it's not as if we're so the problem is that in philanthropy, people who've given that much money away usually have some interest in some policy
Right.
that they want to push, or there'll be sacred cows
Yeah.
that they don't want to have gored, and you're going to bump into it someplace along the way, I think. And I think Laureen Powell Jobs has been very interested in sort of charter schools and experiments with public education. I just don't know how she would feel about a scathing critique of that. But and I have to say, even though I've worked at the New Yorker for almost 25 years, I have, and I'm sure I've stepped on toes of owners. I've never heard a single complaint that had to do with crossing somebody's private interest. So,
Right.
or an advertiser's.
Yeah.
So there's an ethic about it.
Sure, but there's two forms of influence here to be worried about. Think back to, I think it was last summer, this little tempest in a teapot scandal about the New America Foundation here in DC and the Google gifts
Right.
to it, where some unit within New America was promoting a kind of antitrust approach to the large tech companies.
And they were funded by Eric Schmidt.
Funded by Eric Schmidt. And so
Right.
the worry, the worry from the standpoint, from someone like me is not just that there's the risk of the donor saying, we don't want you to cover this story, or we're not going to fund you in the future if you continue to support this unit, but just that the thought would arise in the head of Anne-Marie Slaughter that she could potentially piss off a major donor if they were to do it. That itself is a form of influence, independent of whether or not Eric Schmidt
Absolutely.
ever exercises that influence.
No, absolutely. I don't think it's an ideal kind of situation. I mean, do you actually think there should be a cap on the tax deduction?
Yeah, in the book I propose we should get rid of the tax deduction entirely and replace it with a tax credit. That would treat all donors identically. So the mechanism would be, instead of offering anybody a deduction for their giving, every single citizen gets, call it $1,000 flat capped tax credit. So 50% of any gift you make is forgiven in a credit style. And so when Bill Gates gives away his money, he gets effectively a $1,000 tax write-off. When you or I give away money, we also get the same $1,000 tax write-off. The mechanism treats every citizen equally. All of our voices are promoted from the standpoint of the public policy in identical ways. And then afterwards, if people want to continue giving money away, they can. But it's literally on their dime at that point. And
So
for what it's worth,
basically, it would be a tax increase on the biggest donors.
especially if you didn't have a tax burden, and if wealthy people were in that respect subsidizing you to have a $1,000 repurposable tax credit, that would be a redistributive form of charitable giving. And I'm in favor of that too.
So maybe we should take some questions
do
from
that.
people. I see one over here was,
For questions, let's try to speak into the mic, so I'll just run around and make
and
sure
if
you
you
guys
want to
get
say who you are, that would be great.
Great.
Hi, I'm Caroline O'Shea. I'm a fundraiser, actually, so I'm very interested in all this. But I think you mentioned briefly the idea that by the tax deduction bleeds coffers dry, then allows wealthy people to complain about the effectiveness of government.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate that and a little bit more as a political scientist about how the proliferation of the nonprofit economy, especially for direct service, for goods to the poor, for education, whatnot, bleeds sort of actually not just money, but confidence and in public institutions and in collective solutions rather than kind of a privatized almsgiving, as you were mentioning before.
Right. Okay, so the question has to do with about whether or not a set of nonprofit organizations that are the front line of service delivery, social services, also poses a worry about confidence in government and criticisms about the effectiveness of the state. So imagine here something that likely is will be a sympathetic thought for most people. If we could only outsource to a nonprofit organization the DMV experience, surely a privatized effort there would improve upon the generally miserable experience people have with the Department of Motor Vehicles. That's the basic idea. And when that happens across the board, I think I have two worries about that. So first of all, I don't have any sort of principled objection to the idea that some social services can be appropriately and legitimately provided by nonprofit organizations. Deeper worries about whether or not for-profit prison provision, for example, is a problem. But if it's to a nonprofit organization, I don't have any bright line principle to stand on. I think it's potentially quite good for nonprofits to be the deliverers of public services. But they have to have an accountability structure, which goes back to the citizens and taxpayers and, of course, the beneficiaries, rather than a form of unaccountability that often happens in comparison to the kinds of accountability that attach to public agencies or can attach to public agencies. So that's worry number one. The second is that if there's a devolution of the provision of public services from public agencies to private nonprofit agencies, then I think there is a likely effect of diminishing confidence in the ability of government to provide those services. And that has itself long-stream potential negative effects that lead to the situation we're in many respects today, with record low degree of trust and confidence in the federal government in particular. Just parenthetically here, this is why I think one of the reasons I think that there's much greater confidence among citizens in local government and even in state government than there is here in the federal government, because people actually see the delivery of public services from their locality, oftentimes from their state, and they're more often than not frustrated, in the polarized era we live in makes them distrust the federal government in a way that's not quite the same for other governments.
Hi, Professor. I'm Nick Burns. I was at one of your talks at Stanford last year.
Yeah.
And I read the book, and I enjoyed it very much. As you've described tonight, you, among other things, sort of suggest that we get rid of the tax deduction by applying sort of the principle of equality, other things. But and so I suppose my question is relates to the possible effects of getting rid of that donation, as you mentioned, on this country's private universities, which are the best, arguably, in the world.
Yeah.
I think obviously that the principle of equality is one of the bedrock principles of this country, but so I wonder to an extent, about its sort of possibility of being wielded as a hatchet. When one can be too much like Robespierre and not enough like Turgot, I suppose. I think it's harder to build institutions like our fine private university system, which may be to a degree aristocratic, but I think to a degree that Tocqueville and I think the founders would be supportive of.
Yeah. Good. I have a couple thoughts for you.
I've said enough. But.
So first, the question is about whether changes in public policy and calling attention to various issues of equality would diminish the likelihood that people will give to private universities like the one I work at, very well endowed. And as I said before, I think if it got rid of the deduction entirely, I would predict that there would be smaller giving. First, if you're wondering, is this guy up here who teaches at Stanford University and is, basically funded by the very philanthropy he's now criticizing? So in certain respects, I am biting the hand that feeds me. I have a story to tell about tenure that would be a convenient one to tell. However, I have a kind of redemptive thing to say, which you should hear with the grain of salt that it would be exactly what you might expect the guy who teaches at tenure at this point to say in praise of philanthropy. And this is to go some way to meeting your challenge of the question. The general point of view is this, that I think that too much of the public debate about higher education and selective higher education at places like all these elite institutions with tons of money and endowment focuses on the cost of undergraduate education and the bill that goes to the students and the families who attend. And as anyone knows, if they spent time in an elite institution, a research university has as a second or third mission teaching undergraduates, and the main mission is the research. And I wish that universities were much better at calling attention to the public good of basic research that happens chiefly in elite universities, not alone, but that's where some of the very best minds and scholars in the world are, so that if you gave philanthropically to a place like Stanford, despite having $25 billion in the endowment, and you gave a lot of money, not a $25 contribution to your alumni fund, but a $100 million contribution to set up a new way of doing engineering and artificial intelligence, or ethics, to put it in a completely self-interested way, maybe that over the long run would have huge benefits. So this is this main site in the world where discoveries in basic science happen. Those are huge benefits to all people. And if philanthropy can be a piece of funding that, in addition to public funds, I want that to happen. So last anecdote about this, many of you, if you pay attention to this, are probably familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's podcast in which he's investigated all the giving that goes to places like Stanford. He's hugely sarcastic and critical about it. He interviewed the former president of Stanford a couple years ago, John Hennessy. It seemed to me that Gladwell got the better of that exchange. However, as has been pointed out, Malcolm Gladwell's entire career as a journalist at The New Yorker is on the backs of the research produced by psychologists and sociologists, which if funding went away and it was only the local community college that got philanthropic donations, he would no longer have the stream of research to read and to make his career on. So that's the thing to keep in mind. And that's what I think higher ed needs to be much better at communicating, so that other people see the value of the research enterprise alongside the educational mission.
I think also wasn't what Malcolm Gladwell was writing about was that I think it was Yale was paying more out to the people managing its endowment than it was using that endowment to pay for scholarships for students.
Yeah, or
It was
Gladwell's line he calls
kind of unseemly looking.
right. Harvard is a hedge fund with a little school attached on the side
Okay,
to it.
exactly. So.
My name is Emma Leeds Armstrong. Excuse me. So my question would be, is sort of about the pluralism argument that you try to dispute. What would you say to people right now who are using philanthropy as a means to sort of object to giving this administration funding in the form of taxes?
In the form of taxes.
Right. So like through getting a big deduction from taxpayers from the federal government.
Got it. So the idea is I, as a citizen, have deep objections to the current president and Congress or my elected representative, and rather than duly pay my tax bill, which funds the malevolent or ineffective activity of the administration, I do everything I can to escape taxation because I'd be much better off doing something else with it, especially if we're charitable. Is that the basic idea? Yeah. I can see why the thought enters any person's head, to be sure, but I think it's a devil's bargain in the long run, because if that's a standing thought, then someone with the opposing preferences that you have now returns in 10 years when we have a switch in the administration, then we have a standing opposition to sending tax contributions. And what our task as citizens should be is to duke it out politically and have a level playing field, as it were, to do that, not the dark money type of playing field that actually exists, and then to champion our preferred policies through the ordinary democratic process, rather than attempting to withdraw from it and erect ourselves as philanthropists to correct it. If we want to hold any stock in the long-time operation of democracy as such, we can't absent ourselves from the enterprise and declare ourselves as wiser than the democratic process itself, even if in any particular moment that might likely be a correct judgment.
No, I just wanted to respond to everyone. Not to mention the fact that it's a tax deduction.
Right.
So it's a modest reduction in what you pay. You're still paying toward the
Yeah.
government.
Right. So that's right. So the point was it's not a tax deduction. It doesn't cancel what you've given. So when you make a contribution, it's still some of it's coming out of your own back pocket. But as I pointed out earlier, the perversity, in my view, of the deduction as a mechanism, as opposed to the tax credit, but a deduction gives a systematically greater benefit to wealthy people. So the higher up the income scale you are, the higher your progressive tax bracket, the greater your subsidy rate. Or the line I use in the book is that the wealthier you are, the cheaper it is for you to be virtuous. That's a problem, in my view.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting thoughts. I'm not from America, I'm from the Caribbean. My name is Gregory Gilbert Gums, and what I want to ask is, because most of the conversation was obviously about the United States and the issues dealing with the United States, where philanthropy is a epiphenomenon of a deregulated, class-ridden society at this point in time, with all the contradictions in it. But the problem that, from my part of the world, you have is that some of these philanthropical organizations are starting to have foreign policy in my part of the world, right? With very little influence of the people in those parts of the world on what these organizations are doing, right? In essence, basically a form of philanthropic colonialism at this point in time, right? Philanthropic imperialism. So what I'm wondering is, did you say anything about this in your book? And did you think one of my desperate attempts to democratize philanthropy giving towards people in the, I'm from the Caribbean, but Africa, other parts of Latin America, Central America, et cetera, would be, for example, the Bill Gates Foundation. Right. That does a lot, obviously, in health and different things, right? And some of it, because nothing has been given, is of quite importance. I have to say something to you. One of the big issues that you have in the third world, in many parts of Africa, right, is that the government has pulled itself back from a lot of social issues, right? Yeah. Education, healthcare, stuff like that. This has gone to nonprofits, right? And the government just spends money on, I'm the dictator, so all the money goes to keep me in power. Yeah. So one of my ideas would be, and I would wonder what you think about it. For example, the Bill Gates Foundation, to have some type of, the issue is how you set this up and how you do it in ways that don't corrupt the people who would be part of it. Set up a philanthropical parliament where if you're doing education, if you're doing healthcare, if you're doing development policies in Africa, Caribbean, Central and Latin America, that not Bill Gates and his wife decide to do whatever they want to do, but their ideas, they run by the people who are going to be impacted in extreme fair, because these people are quite poor people, right? Again, I don't come from particularly poor part of the Caribbean. I come from St. Martin, but Haiti, for example, what your president called a shithole country, right? Which is an outrage to me. But what do you think about ways that this can be dealt with? And if you have some ideas, I'd be interested.
I've got a couple of thoughts
you.
about it. So the first is to say, I've given a lot of thought about this. There was an initial chapter of the book that was going to address giving that's going overseas, because it raises a set of very different questions than giving that's done domestically within a democratic society. But the framework of the book is really to analyze, from the standpoint of democratic institutions, how ought we consider the public policy structure for philanthropy. But of course, you're right. Especially large foundations, people want to give overseas. Sometimes they give within other democratic settings. Sometimes they give to non-democratic settings. And sometimes they give to either democratic or non-democratic settings, but where the government is deeply dysfunctional and deeply corrupt. So in many respects, I consider it a standing obligation of a big donor. The Gates Foundation is just the easiest target here. They have a large overseas giving program in global health. To consider this very problem that you're identifying. You called it imperialism. The one I would point to is, does the giving of the Gates Foundation in an overseas context somehow contribute to the building of a public infrastructure, especially one that would be ideally democratically accountable rather than accountable to an authoritarian regime, that allows eventually the Gates Foundation to withdraw, leaving the public infrastructure better off than what it was when it initially showed up on the scene. Now, whether a philanthropic parliament or a group is the right way to go, I don't know enough about exactly the detail. One of the other things I'll say here that stands true, it seems to me, of both domestic philanthropy and overseas philanthropy is that anyone who's worked in a nonprofit organization and then crossed the street to become a grant maker, especially if you're the initial donor, goes overnight and becomes the smartest and best looking and funniest person in the room. And it's very difficult to get honest feedback from your grantees and the beneficiaries. And in some cases, you don't even bother looking for it, even if you wanted it. So there's a standing problem being a donor of getting systematic feedback in an honest way from the people you're intending to help. And that's all the more important to do that in an international circumstance. Because you're interacting with the infrastructure that exists there, where you're not a citizen, you're not a party to that process. And that raises an important dimension to consider.
Thanks for the talk. I'm Alex Daniels from the Chronicle of Philanthropy. And I appreciated your discussion of the political cycles or the quarterly market cycle, and then philanthropy is kind of longer time horizon. And I'm wondering what you think about foundations that operate in perpetuity. Would this commission on philanthropy you envision kind of address that issue?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm in favor of foundations or philanthropy operating on longer time horizons than the marketplace or than government. Perpetuity is an especially long time horizon. I'm opposed to perpetuity. So, one of the movements, a voluntary one these days, that large foundations are set up with the aspiration to spend out either within the life of the donor or, a generation after the principal donors pass away. I think, we're not going to get an answer here that's derived from philosophical principle, but, call it 20 years after the initial donors pass away is a sufficiently long time horizon to operate on. And after that, among the worries about perpetuity, there are several, but the chief one from my point of view is when we both legally protect the donor's wishes after their death, we're setting up a circumstance in which philanthropic assets are legally harnessed to whatever the idiosyncratic purposes of the initial donor. Now, if you have a big, broad general mission, that allows future grant makers to interpret it differently. But most places don't have a big, broad general mission. They have relatively narrow missions. So, the line, not my own, but comes from this, tax law universe. The dead hand of the donor reaches out of the grave to strangle the preferences of all current generations. What would make anyone think, however wise they are, that you can successfully predict circumstances 100 years from now so that your philanthropic cause will be just as important and beneficial and as effective 100 years from now in social circumstances that you have no way of adequately imagining, so that you'd want perpetuity to be the time horizon for your foundation. So I would get rid of perpetuity if I were a philosophical king asked to rewrite the policy structure.
Hi, Rob. Monica Blauer-Miller. Would your commission look at publishing standard metrics of outcomes? So if I'm looking at with my tax money and I have a cause, and then I can say, here are 5 that I'm interested in, but this is really changing this, little kids' lives more, and so I'm going to go there.
Yeah.
We don't have enough of that right now, I don't think, or
Right.
do you?
That's right. Yeah, so the question has to do with measuring the outcomes of charity or philanthropy and how to make those transparent and maybe begin to get better giving on the basis of these outcomes. So on the one hand, I'm completely in favor of there being much more rigorous analysis based upon some generally accepted outcome measures. And sort of full disclosure, this is disclosed in the book, I'm on the board of GiveWell, which is an organization that rates the effectiveness of charitable giving and identifies exceptionally good investment opportunities for your charitable giving, where the return on charitable donations is especially high in human welfare terms. Now, having said that, wanting to call attention to this work, I also would think that it's important to say at the same time that whereas in the financial markets, we all agree what maximizing return on investment looks like, no one across the sector has any trouble identifying what the right outcome is. Within the charitable sector, there are often multiple potential outcomes. So just take GiveWell. GiveWell is concerned with human welfare, but one laudable form of charity is to promote animal welfare. And if you only care about human welfare, then no animal welfare organization will ever register on that outcome metric. So there's almost certainly going to be plural metrics to take into account, and that makes any marketplace in giving akin to the investment marketplace way more complicated to imagine. Sure, one more.
Rob, I know you know that I stand GiveWell, 100%.
Yes, this is Bridget. She's on the board
hi.
of GiveWell too.
My question is, there's a lot of policy problems, but just as a hypothetical, if everyone right now who are these major philanthropists were using their donations to fund GiveWell or other effective altruism type initiatives, would you still support these policy changes?
Yeah. So if people were using their philanthropic dollars, charitable resources to fund GiveWell recommended charities, which have a high degree of confidence in promoting really great human welfare outcomes, would I still worry about these policy changes? Well, so say the obvious thing first. It's, we're so far from a world in which most people think about the effectiveness of charity. Most people, to use the simple phrase, give with their heart, not with their head. Most wealth advisors, when they meet a wealthy person, don't say, let me show you some GiveWell analysis of these great charitable recommendations. They say, tell me your passion, and then I'll help you give, some ideas. So there's so much space in the world as it exists now to have GiveWell recommendations have a greater place. That said, I am myself not an effective philanthropist, effective altruist, I guess I should say. I want to be an effective philanthropist. I don't want to be an effective altruist, even though I'm on the board of an organization that's devoted to it, because I think it would be a bad outcome if 100% of donors were oriented this direction, in part because, especially with GiveWell's case, we've had conversations with the GiveWell people about this. This is a particular form of giving that's basically apolitical. It doesn't take into account whether or not longer time horizon changes that create new organizations rather than analyze existing organizations might turn out to be more effective in the long run than just supporting things that already exist. So effective altruism in the GiveWell form is in certain respects oddly a conservative, status quo-oriented stance to the world. It says, let's not imagine what could happen in 10 years if we were to fund something brand new. That's a low confidence project. It says, let's know what we can get out of charity tomorrow and next week. And that's great given how much philanthropy is completely not guided by the head, but I would never want all philanthropy to be like that.
So Rob, we should wrap it up, but I've got one last question for you too, which is how do you feel about organizations like Donors Trust, which are, I guess they're called donor-advised funds,
right,
where the donor gives money to another organization, so basically their fingerprints are erased, and the public can't see where the money came from.
So the Donors Trust, there's donor-advised funds, and there's also, like we talked about Lorene Pell Jobs. Lorene Pell Jobs doesn't have a private foundation. She has a limited liability company, the Emerson Collective, like the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, like the Open Philanthropy Project, like the Omidyar Network are LLCs. They're not foundations. So they're announced as philanthropic aspirational entities, but they're basically for-profit companies. And the transparency requirements that attach to them are much lower. I mean, they're already low for foundations, as you well know.
But you wind up with secret spending.
Secret spending. So that's my deep objection to those. I think we should have both much bigger payout requirements for donor-advised funds, and we should have greater transparency. But I'll take an asterisk there, and I wonder if you agree or disagree with this. There is a long-standing tradition, partly motivated by religion, but also consecrated in a United States Supreme Court decision, to allow for anonymous giving. And I wouldn't want to make illegal anonymous giving as a whole. I would want for especially large donors to be required, especially if they have political aspirations. That should be disclosed. But the ordinary $50 gift to an organization, even if for a political purpose, seems to me permissibly done anonymously. It's where any particular person has a large amount of power to wield through their wallet that requirements of disclosure and heightened expectations of transparency, I think, are important.
I mean, for me, the issue becomes, because the lines have become so blurred between philanthropy and politics, that if you're giving large donations that are anonymous, such as there's one to the Judicial Crisis Network that we know is something like $25 million that went to picking Supreme Court justices, I think the public's got a great interest in knowing who's picking them, who's paying.
Absolutely.
And so until that line is better clarified and better policed, I'm kind of for more transparency, not less. But anyway, anyway, this has been great. Thank you so much for your expertise and for joining us.
Thanks so much for coming. Thanks for having me.